On rare occasions, a game comes along and changes the industry forever. And after 10 years, Hotline Miami has influenced countless titles and continues to do so. It inspired a whole new generation of game developers because of its stylish and interesting approach to over-the-top violence in video games. Hotline Miami released in 2012 and was developed by Dennaton Games, a two-man team which consisted of Jonathan Soderstrom and Dennis Whedon. Soderstrom was the programmer and Dennis was the artist. Before the release of Hotline Miami, Soderstrom and Dennis were just two individuals passionate about making video games they thought would be fun to play. For the next game, Dennis went through a bunch of unfinished prototypes Soderstrom had worked on over the years and came across a top-down shooter named Super Carnage. Soderstrom had scrapped this game because of its issues with enemy pathfinding. However, Dennis was a fan of top-down shooters and thought it would be fun to revive this project and make their own. Over one weekend, Dennis did the basic graphics and proceeded from there with an aim of making a small arcade game. Devolver Digital got word of Dennaton's latest project in development and asked if they could make it something much bigger. From here, Hotline Miami was born. Hotline Miami was an overnight success and was a smash hit with PC gamers. It received overwhelmingly positive reviews across multiple publications, and it was pretty much what most people in the PC gaming community were talking about for a while. In 2012, it was considered by many to be Game of the Year and one of the best games of all time, later receiving multiple nominations for Best PC Action Game, Best PC Game, and Best PC Story. It was unlike anything anyone had seen before due to its unique, vibrant color palette, killer soundtrack, and punishing yet satisfying gameplay loop. Hotline Miami consists of self-contained levels with tight, densely packed rooms where your objective is to enter a building and kill everyone inside while wearing a selection of masks which grant the player different perks. If you die, well, you go back to the start of the floor you are on. The enemies are challenging, which require you to either take on a room quickly and effectively or plan ahead while also being extremely cautious. The gameplay loop can be seen almost like a puzzle. Each room requires the player to understand the various enemy types and their patterns, then identify a possible solution of entering and eliminating everyone in the planned strategy. It can almost be compared to a boss in any Soulsborne title. For example, a Soulsborne boss could be seen as a puzzle. You are tasked with taking down a greater foe, but it's not as easy as you think, which requires you to find a strategy and perform the solution. You have to identify the boss's attacks and critical strikes, so you can ensure you can time your attacks and dodges perfectly to ensure you are successful without being killed. However, if you do die, you do have to rethink your strategy and try again until you find a solution that works. Sometimes in Hotline Miami, if your approach doesn't go according to plan, you will have to think on your feet, quickly solving the fast approaching problems. And this constant gameplay loop throughout the entire game never ceases to entertain players, because once a level is cleared, you feel a great sense of accomplishment. It feels especially rewarding when you replay through a level and memorize enemy types and behavior, then proceed to kill everyone in a building while also ensuring you don't break your combo meter. You feel like an unstoppable force, which is further fueled with the absolutely banging soundtrack, which further ignites the entire playing experience. The sheer success of Hotline Miami can be seen in indie games that were released in the following years and can still be seen in titles releasing today. Although Hotline Miami has insanely fun gameplay, it's so much more than that. To most, it may seem like you're a normal retro arcade top-down shooter, but Soderstrom wanted to focus on making Hotline Miami a game aimed towards adults, and this is where the narrative element of Hotline Miami is what makes it truly shine. The themes, characters, violence, and ideas are evidently aimed towards adults, which stick with the player long after they've played the game. I remember playing Hotline Miami when it first released on PC, and I was gripped from the very get-go due to the superb and excellent repetitive gameplay loop, which is accompanied by the sensational soundtrack. But it wasn't just the gameplay I was interested in, it was the story as well. You see, Hotline Miami has a very vague story, and if you want to understand it fully, you have to go looking for it. It's not served up on a silver platter for the player to indulge in. You can play the game from start to finish and not really care about the story and still feel satisfied when the credits roll. But for people like myself, I wanted to figure out the bigger picture of Hotline Miami, and I attempted to do my best to uncover the story. After replaying the game countless times and reading and watching people's findings, I came to roughly understand what the story is all about, and it tells a more important message to the player, which is present in every single level. So after the huge success of Hotline Miami, which rapidly saw Dennaton and Devolver Digital to all new heights in the gaming industry, the pressure was on to deliver a sequel which would live up to and surpass everything the original delivered on. Dennaton immediately got to work on the sequel, which originally started out as a DLC package which would be around the same size as the first game. However, due to Dennaton's plans and ideas, this DLC package grew into its own standalone title, named Hotline Miami 2 Wrong Number. The excitement and expectations the PC community had for Hotline Miami 2 were beyond high. So when Hotline Miami 2 Wrong Number released in 2015, 3 years after the original, it was, well, met by an extremely mixed reception. There were people who thoroughly enjoyed Hotline Miami 2 and believed it was exactly what fans wanted from a sequel, yet there were a lot more people who heavily disliked it for what it did differently. Some critics really disliked everything Hotline Miami 2 did differently from its predecessor. The main complaints from critics were the game was just too difficult, the level design was janky, and the ending was abysmal, and because of these general views, it turned a lot of people off from wanting to play it. Furthermore, when the game got into the hands of the community, the general public disliked the narrative structure and the multi-protagonists this anticipated sequel prided itself on. It was coined a cheap knockoff, incomprehensible version of Pulp Fiction. It was overall viewed as a disappointing sequel and a complete mess. I, however, never played Hotline Miami 2 Wrong Number when it first released, even though I was a huge fan of the original. Instead, I finally got round to playing it for the first time in 2022 on my Steam Deck. I replayed through the original Hotline Miami before I began Hotline Miami 2 to ensure I was caught up to speed on the story and back into the flow of the combat. So after playing and completing Hotline Miami 2 for the first time, I must admit, I didn't enjoy it quite like the original. I wish for a smash here that would continue and build on from what the original did so well, but it simply wasn't there. The gameplay was very different from the original, with levels being longer and larger, with an open plan designed than the original's well-made, densely packed small rooms and corridors. Enemies were more brutally challenging and unforgiving, with most levels consisting of me dying by getting shot at from enemies off screen. I was forced to play in certain ways, unlike where the original allowed you to approach levels freely with the different masks. The narrative was extremely disjointed, with it being told through the 8 different story arcs of 12 playable characters which take place before Hotline Miami 1, during Hotline Miami, and after Hotline Miami in a non-chronological order. Confusing, right? So after completing Hotline Miami 2, I came away from it feeling massively disappointed and utterly let down by the sequel. I tossed it to one side and never cared to look into it further. But after some time had passed, in a weird turn of events, I couldn't help stop thinking of the characters, narrative, and themes of Hotline Miami 2 long after playing. I started to feel like the characters meant something much more than just a vessel to offer different playstyles in exciting new levels with an all-new electrifying soundtrack. I couldn't shake thinking of Hotline Miami 2. So this is when I decided to watch video essays on people's experience with the sequel, and that's when I came to slowly understand Hotline Miami 2 was something much greater than I could have ever imagined. I decided to boot up Hotline Miami 2 again and give it another shot, this time with more understanding on the deeper meaning of the characters and themes that the narrative heavily focuses on. I completed Hotline Miami 2 again and I finally understood it for what it was. I did a complete 180 on Hotline Miami 2 and considered it to be the sequel we the fans had hoped for. In this video essay, I will be discussing the entire story of Hotline Miami 2 and examining the characters and the meaning behind the themes presented. In order to do this, let's recap the story of the first Hotline Miami. Hotline Miami takes place in April 1989, where the player takes control of our silent protagonist, Jackie. We know nothing about Jackie, who he is, what he does, what's his backstory, nothing. All we know is that he receives cryptic anonymous messages on his answering machine telling him to perform jobs at specific addresses which are revealed to be known Russian mafia strongholds. Jacket arrives at each of these locations and dons one of many animal masks the player can choose from to conceal his identity before he massacres everyone inside. After leaving these places, Jacket goes home and the cycle continues, waking up in his apartment and receiving another message on his answering machine. Pink leaflets are scattered throughout his apartment, but at this point in the story, we have no context for them and they appear as minor details we can observe. After each level, Jacket visits various neutral places before he repeats the same loop again the following day. Each place he visits has the same friendly bearded chap working there who likes to engage in friendly conversation. Later on, Jacket saves a woman from one of the Russian mafia strongholds, who later becomes his girlfriend. Throughout the story, Jacket is visited by masked animal figures in his dreams. These masked figures are the horse, the owl, and the rooster, who is named Richard. They ask him cryptic questions about his situation, such as the big one, which sticks with most players, is, do you enjoy hurting other people? The story continues, and after more and more bloodshed, unsettling hallucinations appear frequently in Jacket's life, which question his perception on what is real anymore. Eventually, Jacket arrives home after hitting another Russian mafia stronghold and discovers his girlfriend has been murdered by another masked figure, wearing a rat mask. The masked figure shoots Jacket and he falls into an unconscious state. It is then revealed that everything we have experienced up until this point has been us reliving the events of the last 2 months in a comatose state. Jacket awakens in the hospital and becomes aware that the police now know who he is and what violent acts he has been committing. Jacket escapes the hospital and searches for the stranger who wore the rat mask and killed his girlfriend. He fights his way through the police station to find the masked figure has been arrested and decides to confront him. Finally, our protagonist then decides to finish what he had started and heads to the Russian mafia headquarters, killing the leaders of this organized crime syndicate. After executing the final leader of the Russian mafia, Jacket steps out onto the balcony, lights a cigarette, and throws a photo off. The credits fake out and unexpectedly time rewinds where we are now playing as Biker. Just like Jacket, Biker has also been receiving strange messages on his answering machine asking him to perform random jobs. But the difference between them both is Biker wishes to find the source of these messages and put an end to it. Biker discovers the individuals behind the answering machine messages are a group named 50 Blessings and uncovers that there are multiple people receiving these answering machine messages, all with the same task of killing everyone inside known Russian mafia strongholds. The purpose of the 50 Blessings organization is to damage the alliance between the Soviet Union and the United States. After uncovering the 50 Blessings and their plans, Biker leaves their base of operations and the true credits roll. Although this is the true story behind Hotline Miami, there's a greater message asked. Do you enjoy hurting other people? Throughout the entire game, you hyper-violently murder countless people without giving the thought of why are you doing this and if it's right. Most players share this level of an unquestionable mindset like Jacket at the beginning of Hotline Miami, never questioning the answer machine messages because they enjoy the entertaining ultraviolet gameplay loop. Whereas near the end of the game, players start to question the bigger picture, just like how Biker receives the same messages and is determined to understand their meaning and stop them. With the original Hotline Miami covered, we can now discuss and explore Hotline Miami 2. If you hadn't guessed it at this point, Hotline Miami is set in an alternate timeline. In 1985, the Cold War escalated and the Soviet Union and the United States war began. The war took place mainly in Hawaii, where US soldiers were stationed. The war came to an end with the nuking of San Francisco, and what followed was the Soviet Union and United States alliance. The coalition was to allow immigrants of Russian origin into America and to stop the war completely. Angered by this, the 50 Blessings was formed, a shadow organization with patriotic goals against the newly formed coalition. 50 Blessings went on to recruit people such as Jacket through the pink leaflets to form a group of hitmen whose goal it was to enter known Russian mafia strongholds and kill everyone inside. After the events of Hotline Miami, the Russian crime syndicate is completely destroyed and Jacket is arrested under police investigation and stands trial for his crimes. This is where Hotline Miami 2 starts. Hotline Miami 2 is not so much another mindless top-down shooter with narrative elements sprinkled in. Hotline Miami 2 is a lot different than Hotline Miami 1. It furthers the plot and presents to you the aftermath of the first game. The story and characters take front and center stage, and this is where Hotline Miami 2 shines. Hotline Miami 1 asked the question, do you enjoy hurting people? Hotline Miami 2 isn't asking this again, because if you're playing the sequel, the answer is clear. Hotline Miami 2 questions and presents the participation of violence and its results. Hotline Miami 2 begins with an introduction to an in-universe movie titled The Midnight Animal. We take control of our first playable character, Martin, an actor who's playing the role of the Midnight Animal, a character based on Jackie. And the premises of this movie is to showcase all his violent crimes in an over-exaggerated story. The movie depicts the Midnight Animal killing helpless victims trying to escape his violent rampage. A fictional version of Jacket's girlfriend appears, but her relationship with the Midnight Animal is extremely dark and twisted. Once the level is cleared, the set and camera crew are revealed. This introduction to Hotline Miami 2 is extremely unsettling and disturbing, setting the tone of how dark and unpredictable the rest of the game will be for the player. Act 1 exposition begins and acts as the introduction, showcasing the all new characters and presenting the impact it's had on them following the events of the original game. We're first introduced to the fans, consisting of Alex, Ash, Corey, Tony, and Mark. It's pretty clear the fans represent those players who appreciated the stylish aesthetics and exhilarating hyper-violent gameplay of Hotline Miami 1. Since this group is attempting to resemble Jackie, although it may not seem clear, we're immediately made aware that some of the characters we play as in Hotline Miami 2 serve as reflections or depictions for their real-world counterparts and the fans of the first presentation of this. The fans are essentially fans of Jackie. They believe everything he did was cool and righteous, looking up to him as some sort of action movie star. They wish to live out this fantasy of Jacket's life and kill for sport. It's during this party that the fans decide to begin to replicate what Jacket did and become the copycat killers. They hop in their banged up graffitied van, which sports the circle with 3 lines through it, which appears in the first game, further showcasing how the fans are trying so hard to be wannabe Jackets. They head to an apartment building which is currently occupied by a 2-bit startup gang and murder everyone inside. The difference between Jacket and the fans is that Jacket was being instructed to perform his killings, whereas the fans are doing this on their own accord. And just like Jackie, after they committed these ungodly crimes, they decide to visit a store and grab pizza before calling it a night. Just a few days before the fans begin their first hunt, we take control of another fan favourite character in Hotline Miami 2, Manny Pardo, a gruffled detective with a serious taste for blood who is investigating the serial killings of the Miami Mutilator. He arrives at a recent crime scene where the serial killer has taken another victim. Manny insists that the press will be all over this case, but he is immediately shut down by another officer telling him they're already busy with all of the other killings happening in the city. Manny finishes up at the crime scene and leaves. Jumping back in time to 1989, the same time period of Jacket's story. I told you this game's story jumped back and forth. We're now playing as Jake, an ultra-nationalist who receives an answering machine message asking him to perform a job at a specified location. Jake mindlessly attempts to talk to the pre-recorded message, but fails, and the message ends. Within Jake's apartment, we see the same scattered pink leaflets that were also in Jacket's apartment, which were from the 50 Blessings. Just like Jacket's story, it's clear what Jake's role is in the story and what he is going to do. Jake goes to a known Russian mafia hideout and kills everyone inside. Afterwards, he swings on by a tattoo parlor to get some ink to mark the occasion, but is denied since they are fully booked. Jake insults the man behind the counter because of his nationality being Russian and proceeds to leave. We return to Martin, the actor who plays the Midnight Animal, where he is being interviewed for a television program. During this interview, it is revealed that the Midnight Animal is a new type of role for Martin, since he's never starred in a horror slasher movie before. Martin abruptly responds to a question asked to him by the show host and openly admits he's always wanted to kill people and enjoys the entire act of murdering someone. This role brings him a great amount of pleasure he has never experienced before. During this interview, Martin is visited by Richard, the same rooster figure from Jacket's dreams. Richard tells Martin the movie he's starring in has a pretty big twist in the end, one which he won't like, or no one will like for that matter, with the second point being directly aimed towards the player. Following on from this encounter, we take control of Martin, but we the player aren't quite sure if this is a dream or if it's part of the movie. Martin is arrested and taken to the police station for questioning. From here, Martin escapes and mows through dozens of police officers, eventually confronting his fictional girlfriend, who shoots him at point blank range. It's suddenly revealed that this was indeed all real, and it was part of the movie they were filming. The director calls for the scene to be stopped. However, Martin is still on the ground and has been killed by the prop gun, which has evidently been swapped out for a live firearm. This was the twist Richard informed Martin about. However, Martin continued to carry on down this violent road, which led to his own annihilation. If the fans are supposed to represent those players who enjoyed the aesthetics and exciting gameplay from the first game, I believe Martin represents the type of players who enjoyed the violent gameplay and gore from the original and couldn't care less about the story. And with the escalation of Martin's disturbing obsession with the role of the Midnight Animal and playing out his violent fantasy, it leads to his own sudden demise, which immediately shocks the player and continues to set the unsettling tone for what the rest of the game has in store for them. This supports that Hotline Miami 2 is not asking the same question like the original proposed, but instead showcases the participation and escalation of violence and its gruesome results. I think at this point it is pretty apparent how the narrative of Hotline Miami 2 can be seen as chaotic and cluttered, with jumping between characters at different time periods at different points of the story, and attempting to carry this approach throughout the rest of this video essay will only confuse matters further. So from now onwards, I will be focusing only on the main plot points from each act. Following on from the shocking and confusing ending of Act 1, the opening level of the second act shows us a courtroom where we get to see Jackie on trial for the crimes he committed during Hotline Miami 1. From the hearing, we learn that the judge is aware of the phone calls Jackie received, but is unable to establish what was said during these phone calls, and even if they were instructing him to perform the murders he committed. This hearing teases a possible continuation of the story from Hotline Miami 1 into 2, but before we hear more, we take control of Evan, a writer who is working on a book detailing the horrors of the masked maniac, i.e. Jackie. Evan leaves the courtroom and calls Manny Pardo, the detective investigating the Miami mutilator. Evan asks Manny if he has any information he can share on Jackie, which will help towards the completion of his book. Manny directs him to a dangerous Russian mafia hideout, promising to have answers there. Evan, obsessed with uncovering the true story behind the masked maniac, blindly heads into this Russian mafia hideout. Evan's playstyle is unlike anyone else's in the entire series, since he can only use melee weapons and is unable to pick up lethal weapons unless he enters a rage-induced state. This playstyle helps build Evan's character as someone who is against violence. This is further supported when Evan reaches the Russian mafia hideout and accidentally kills the henchman at the door. He attempts to revive him but fails, then running inside the building and calling for help. Evan doesn't want to resort to violence, but will do what he must to ensure he can finish his book. The rest of the act focuses the spotlight onto both the fans attempting to make a name for themselves, evidently resulting in them killing more people for no good reason at all, and an unnamed Russian mobster who is looking to start a new life. This act is more focused on the Russian mobster than any of the other characters. The Russian mobster wants to get out of the life of crime, and so his boss sends him on one last job. The mobster is extremely successful with his final job, and he discovers a heap ton of cash that will help him start his new life. The mobster heads home and crashes out for the night. While dreaming, he is visited by Richard, who warns him that the road he is on is going to result in a bad ending. Richard at this point can almost be seen as the Grim Reaper of Hotline Miami, visiting each protagonist before their untimely death. Yet each time Richard visits a protagonist, he attempts to sway them onto the right path. But by this point, each protagonist is too far gone and is more than happy with the violent lives they live. The mobster's role in all of this may seem by some as a filler protagonist, serving no purpose to the story whatsoever. However, I believe his role is to provide insight into the lives of the countless members of the Russian mafia that we've killed. We mindlessly kill these mobsters, never stopping to think for a second that each one may have a life outside of the purpose of being killed to complete a level. It gives us a face to the mobsters that we slay, and Hotline Miami 2 does a terrific job at it by giving us this level with very little context on who he is and his goals. However, as Richard predicts, this all comes crashing down. Level 4 execution opens with a bang. We witness the mobster inside a club experiencing the lowest of lows, drugged out of his mind after he has discovered that his girlfriend has left him and stole the mass amount of wealth he obtained from his final job. His world has come crashing down on him. The player is readying themselves to play as the mobster, but they'd be wrong. The soundtrack explodes at just the right moment, and out of nowhere the fans come crashing in with a high octane opening, proceeding to perform another unsupported reckless killing spree. I have to admit, this is one of my favourite levels in the entirety of Hotline Miami 2, purely for the banging score and how the game surprises the player by giving you control of the fans instead of the mobster. With the conclusion of this level, the fans enter the room where the mobster is experiencing a drug-induced living nightmare. The fans drag his body onto the floor and proceed to execute him in the most extreme, punishing way. For the first time in the entirety of Hotline Miami, we care about the death of one of these mobsters, purely for the brief exposure we had into his life within one level. We don't know much about him, but when the fans execute him, we feel the sense of disappointment. There shouldn't be any feelings whatsoever for this character because we've been able to kill dozens upon dozens of these mobsters so far without thinking twice. But after playing through his one level and witnessing what has happened to him, makes you feel almost bad. This is a perfect presentation of how impactful the narrative can be in Hotline Miami 2. At this point, the pacing and direction of Hotline Miami 2 feels like it keeps working towards a conclusion at the end of each act. Yet we're just met with the untimely demise of another protagonist. The third act, titled The Climax, seems to indicate that this is where we'll get a true conclusion to an act. Act 3 starts with us going back in time to 1985, where the war being fought in Hawaii between the US and Russia took place. The protagonist this time? Beard, the same individual who we saw multiple times in the original. Beard is also accompanied by Jackie, which proposes the idea that during this period, we'll see the friendship built between Beard and Jackie, which was showcased during the events of Hotline Miami 1. The pair leave a bar and a journalist takes a picture of them, afterwards passing the photograph to Beard for keepsakes. After completing Beard's level, we jump back into the normal timeline of Hotline Miami 2. The fans proceed to perform another mindless hit on a gang stronghold, which leads them to discover a much darker operation happening, which they don't investigate in detail, further supporting the theory that the fans just want to kill as many people as possible for fun and to make a name for themselves. They could do the right thing here, but they decide not to. They're not interested in attempting to do the right thing. We get another Manny level where he proceeds to solely attack a Colombian gang drug operation and bring it down. In the final level of this act, we take control of the fans. They're in their hideout trying on new masks. During this moment, they are visited by Richard, who speaks through them in riddles, almost teasing the inevitable. They snap out of this dreamlike state and receive an incoming call from the mobster's phone, which they picked up after executing him. They answer the call and it is from the mobster's boss. He tells them that the Russian mafia are back at the top of the criminal empire again and wishes for him to pay him a visit. The fans believe that this is their big moment, their time to shine, the moment that they have been working towards, the opportunity to attack the heart of the Russian mafia. The fans roll out and head to the Russian Mafia HQ. After the visit from Richard and this being the final level in this act, the player can almost predict the fan's fate at the end of this level, Death Wish. The entire act has been leading up to this very point, the climax, and for some, this is where the game hits its peak. The fans make their way to the Russian Mafia HQ and prepare to ascend the tower. Everything from the level design, playing as the different members of the fans, the brutality, violence, and most importantly the soundtrack is what makes this level perfect and one of the best. No pun intended, but this is fans of Hotline Miami 2's favourite level. After the fans have brutally murdered their way through waves and waves of mobsters, Alex and Ash make their way up to the roof. They attempt to make contact with the rest of the team, but that conscious thought the player has had with them throughout the entire level becomes a reality, with Alex and Ash being abruptly shot dead by the head of the organization. The game fades to black, and you can't help but think what has happened to the other members of the fans. You're hoping that they've survived and that Alex and Ash were the only losses. But before Act 4 starts, we take control of Manny Pardo, entering a hallway swarmed with SWAT. Manny takes it upon himself to walk down the hallway, past all of the SWAT, and enter the room they are surrounding. Inside, Tony is alive and unarmed, while Corey and Mark are lying in their own pools of blood. Tony's personality suddenly shifts from what we previously experienced, with him now begging for his life. That cool persona of attempting to impersonate Jacka has ceased to exist. Manny doesn't care for Tony's life and kills him, then exits the room. Manny lies to the SWAT officer and says that Tony pulled a gun on him first, hence his reaction. Any crossover or transitions of themes from the original Hotline Miami is now gone, with the death of the fans. There's no wannabe cool protagonist wearing masks which give you cool abilities while killing Russian mobsters. The player is heading into the unknown now. The developers literally told the player that this act would be the game's climax with its title, and it was. The faces of Hotline Miami 2, which we believe the sequel was going to focus on, are now gone, and everything everyone wanted from the sequel is immediately shut down. The following acts, beginning with the fourth, Falling, is where the player base for Hotline Miami 2 split off, or became divided. People who proceeded on with Hotline Miami 2 from this point either appreciated the game for the themes and concepts it explored, or either heavily disliked what it tried to do differently. I am a huge fan of Hotline Miami 2, but I can also completely understand why a certain percentage of the player base disliked the game from this point. The fourth act opens with Evan on the subway, where he is stopped by a homeless person asking for spare change. At this moment, Evan is visited by Richard, who warns him that if he continues to pursue the completion of his book on the masked maniac, he will lose what is closest to him, his family. Before Evan can process this information, he disappears. After Richard's appearance before the fan's death, this visit adds tension and speculation around Evan's fate following his level. The level now truly begins with Evan stuck in a subway station that has been taken over by local gangsters, where he must fight his way through to the exit. The sudden shift in protagonists between this level and the previous, from playing the fans at their highest gameplay point, murdering countless waves of mobsters, making you feel like an unstoppable force, to now playing as Evan, who can't kill enemies or pick up their weapons, makes the player feel helpless and overwhelmed. You're questioning at this point, where's the story heading? Most of the protagonists you played so far have been brutally murdered, so will the rest of the protagonists' fate result in the same? We, the player, are heading into the unknown with a great sense of fear for each character's life. Evan makes it out of the subway station and visits an elderly woman whose son was involved in the events of Jacket's killing spree within the first game. The son has gone into hiding, but Evan, obsessed with uncovering the story, leaves his card in case he decides to call to share information that will contribute towards his book. After this, we jump back in time to Beard fighting the war in Hawaii, where he is sent on some pretty crazy missions. Then, in a strange turn of events, we take control of Jake once more. Yes, the character who we played as in the first act. Well, Jake is sent to hit another Russian mafia stronghold and successfully clears the entire first floor. However, when Jake arrives on the second floor, the game decides to do something interesting and spin one of its recurring themes on its head. If the player dies on the second floor, that's it. There is no restart. Jake is dead. He's dragged off screen and killed by two Russian henchmen, leaving the player shocked and confused. It may feel that for the entirety of Act 4, since the fans died, that not a lot has happened, but that all changes with the final level within this act. We finally see the conclusion of Beard's story during the war. Beard and his squad are sent on one final mission, one that his commander believes will result in the squad's death. This level is by far one of the most challenging levels in Hotline Miami 2, because the player can be killed many times by enemies off screen. This is probably the mission I had the most restarts in. Eventually, Beard and his squad clear the power plant. The whole power plant begins to self-destruct around the whole squad. Jacket is suddenly injured by an explosion, but Beard proceeds to carry him out through a labyrinth-designed maintenance tunnel, with the time for detonation taken away. Beard saves Jacket's life and they both escape. As the rescue team arrives, Beard passes Jacket the photograph that was taken earlier of the two, giving him something to remember him by. We come to understand now why Jacket kept seeing that reoccurring friendly mysterious bearded character within Hotline Miami 1. Beard saved his life, and Jacket is forever in his debt. As I mentioned previously, we knew nothing about Jacket in the first Hotline Miami, who he is, what he does, what's his backstory, nothing. However, after playing through Beard's missions, we find out so much more about him, even with nothing being said. Then we come to understand that the photograph Jacket tosses off the balcony at the end of the original isn't a picture of his girlfriend, which many speculated. This photograph was of Beard and Jacket that was taken during the war, and Jacket tossing the photograph off the balcony signifies that he is finally done fighting. During the war, Beard shares with his squad his small dream of wishing to own a convenience store, and he finally gets this quiet life once the war is over. Beard proceeds to continue with his life, running a convenience store, and is why Jacket visualizes this during the original game. However, this is Hotline Miami, and what seems like a happy ending for Beard doesn't last for long. As the dark truth of this world becomes present, Beard steps out of his convenience store, and his existence is erased. San Francisco is nuked, and the war comes to an end. This was the bomb that was dropped, setting up the events of Hotline Miami. The Soviet Union and United States agree on an alliance, and the coalition is formed, allowing immigrants of Russian origin into America, leading to the insurrection of the 50 Blessings. Beard's death supports the theory of why Jacket signed up to the 50 Blessings and didn't question his purpose in this grand scheme while killing countless members of the Russian mafia. Once Jacket eliminated the heads of the Russian crime syndicate, his quest for revenge concludes. He steps out onto the balcony, lights a smoke, and takes one last look at the photograph before he tosses it away, marking the end of his journey. Act 5 begins with Evan receiving a phone call from the elderly woman's son, Richter. Richter retells his events and experience with the 50 Blessings during Jacket's killing spree. This is where we take control of our new protagonist. Richter openly signs up to become a member of the 50 Blessings, but once he finds out their true motives and what that entails, he becomes extremely reluctant in participating with their assignments for him. The 50 Blessings proceed to threaten Richter with torching his car. Therefore, he eventually agrees to execute their orders. It's an interesting insight to see that Richter is the first protagonist in the series who signed up to the 50 Blessings and is against the killings and their notions, unlike Jacket, Jake, and Biker to some degree. This too gives us a deeper perspective on some of the individuals who signed up to the 50 Blessings and don't wish to proceed with the killings. They either really wanted to carry out with their orders or didn't, and if that was the matter, they would be threatened to do so, just like what they did to Richter. Just like the Russian mobster from Act 2, it humanizes Richter. If you didn't put two and two together, Richter is the masked figure wearing the rat mask who killed Jacket's girlfriend in the original. Richter, who is seen as one of the antagonists from the original, becomes a likable protagonist in Hotline Miami 2, one that the player is rooting for. Richter doesn't need to be this cool, badass character that people like the fans look up to, but instead he can just be a normal guy attempting to break away from the firm grasp the 50 Blessings has over his life. At the end of each of Richter's levels, he proceeds to take care of his elderly mother, which makes you develop a small sense of care for this character. During the events of Hotline Miami 1, Richter is eventually caught and imprisoned for his crimes. In the final level of Act 5, we take control of Richter in prison. During his sentence, Richter is visited by two mysterious strangers, who are secretly the developers' cameos, Jonathan Soderstrom and Dennis Whedon. These two strangers speak to Richter in a vague manner, and we can assume they are controlling members of the 50 Blessings, visiting him to tie up loose ends. Richter has no idea who these two strangers are and leaves. This is where all hell breaks loose and is the explosive finale of Act 5, in which the player has the strong feeling that this level isn't going to have a happy ending, given the recurring theme of a character dying at the end of each act. One of the inmates attempts to kill Richter, but fails to do so, and what follows is a catastrophic riot within the prison. Richter blasts his way through cellmates and prison guards, eventually disguising himself as a prison officer to escape the correctional facility, successfully unnoticed. Richter finishes his conversation with Evan and asks him if he can purchase him a ticket to Hawaii so his elderly mother can join him. After hearing his story, Evan agrees to organise paying for the ticket and ends the call. This is where Hotline Miami 2 decides to give us our first choice. Evan reads a letter from his partner telling him that she's left with their children due to Evan's obsession with uncovering the story behind the masked maniac. Evan is now given two choices. He can continue writing his book and finalise the story, or head back to the telephone to call his partner. If the player paid attention to what Richard had to say to Evan on the subway, you know what the right choice to make here is. After selecting your choice, the sixth and final act will begin. Catastrophe. This is where it all comes to an end. Before the player takes control of a character, they're left wondering, how will this all end? The only people remaining in the story are Manny, Evan, and Richter. So how are the stories connected, and who lives and who dies? In a wild turn of events, we take control of the son, the child of the Russian mafia boss who was killed at the end of Hotline Miami 1 by Jackie. The son believes it's his destiny to take back what's rightfully his after it was stolen away from him following his father's passing. The levels that follow are by far some of the hardest and most extreme. The following levels consist of the son storming the Colombian mafia strongholds and killing as many as he can to claim the territory back for the Russian mafia. In the aftermath of his attack on the Colombian mafia, the son decides to perform a bank heist, and once he's brutally murdered his way into the vault, he is visited by his father, who transforms into the supernatural being Richard. Richard warns him that just like his father, he won't understand the path he is on until it's too late. Before the son's story continues, we jump back to Manny Pardo, as he still searches to find the serial killer, the Miami Mutilator. Manny arrives home after visiting another crime scene and heads to bed. He wakes up panicking, flustered that he can't find something which holds significant importance to him. Manny heads back to the crime scene from earlier and is greeted by a strange man. At this moment, it is revealed that Manny is the Miami Mutilator. We discover that he's been murdering individuals and orchestrating crime scenes while planting fake evidence. Manny's reasoning for this is due to fame. It's apparent throughout his entire story, as he shows jealousy in the form of disgust towards the attention the masked maniac, aka Jackie, has received for his crimes. Manny wants the spotlight on him and his case, believing the Miami Mutilator to be far more interesting than Jackie. But the funny thing is, no one is bothered. He even says to Evan earlier on in the story that he should be writing a book on the Miami Mutilator rather than wasting his time on Jackie's story. His last words to the fans before he executes Tony are, "You want your 15 minutes of fame? I don't think so." Manny can't help but be jealous of these murderers in the city. He wants to become famous for investigating the Miami Mutilator. Manny's story comes to an end with an all-out assault on the police station because they're now in possession of evidence that can identify him as the serial killer. The police station is swarmed by officers and they shoot Manny on sight. But this was all a dream. Manny's reality is crushing all around him, and his story concludes with him sheltering himself in his apartment. We return to the son to see him go on to finally finish the Colombian Mafia by organising a huge raid on their HQ and wiping every single one of them out, leading us into the final level of Hotline Miami 2. How is this all going to end? Mark was killed by a prop gun being replaced with a live firearm. The henchman lost his girlfriend and his prize money, eventually being executed. The fans had their explosive finale in the final level of Act 4, Climax, where they attacked the Russian mobster HQ and were killed one by one. Beard dies in the nuclear blast that wipes out San Francisco. Jake is unexpectedly killed by Russian mobsters as he carries out orders given to him by the 50 Blessings. And Manny loses his mind and shelters himself in his apartment, afraid of being found out as the serial killer. This leaves 3 protagonists still alive: Evan, Richter, and the son. So how are their stories connected, and how does this all end, and who lives and who dies? After successfully destroying the Colombian Mafia and the Russian mob regaining control of the criminal underworld of Miami, the son throws a party at the Russian Mafia HQ and consumes a serious amount of drugs, leading him on a drug-induced acid nightmare. Everything the game has featured this far is now dialed to the max, and the son goes on a psychotic massacre, visualizing that his men are Richard, then brutally murdering each one of them. As the son battles his way through this acid nightmare, he fights mythical beasts, each one resembling the fans, giving us the understanding of how the Sun killed each one of the fans. There's one final showdown between the Sun and Corey and Ash's godlike beings. The Sun slays the beast and believes in the psychotic enhanced nightmare he has won. He steps out onto the Asgardian Bifrost Bridge and the credits roll. You're left confused by what you had just experienced, but before you can process anything, you're interrupted by the credits cut short, like an emergency broadcast, and the final cutscene is played out. We see Richter and his fragile mother in Hawaii, living a peaceful life, watching TV, and just like the credits, this moment of happiness is interrupted by an emergency broadcast. A news reporter announces to the American public that both the US and Russian president have been assassinated, and this can only mean nuclear war between both countries. We receive one final visit from Richard, who speaks to Richter and explains how this was always going to happen, and there isn't anything that can be changed to stop this. Richter accepts his fate. The true ending of Hotline Miami 2 is revealed, and this game was never about who lived and died, because at the end of all this, everyone suffers the same fate, and there's nothing that no one can do about it. Every character left alive is annihilated by the atomic blast of the nuclear warheads dropping on America. Evan, Richter, Manny, Jackie, everyone is a victim to this devastating action. The question that stays with the player throughout the entire story of who lives and dies is answered. No one does. Some of the characters in Hotline Miami 2 serve as metaphors for their real-life counterparts, or something that represents an aspect of this franchise. As we touched on briefly during the start, Martin represents the individuals who enjoyed the violence of the first game and didn't care too much about the story. The fans represent those players who really enjoyed the aesthetics and coolness of everything that made Hotline Miami so special. Evan resonates with the players who wanted to find out the true story at the heart of Hotline Miami. Jake represents the real-life counterpart of ultra-nationalist hate groups. He calls out for his love for the Confederate flag and insults the Russian tattoo shop owner. He signs up to the 50 Blessings because he believes the people he's killing are scum, and to feed his own ego. The previous games developed by Denton before Hotline Miami weren't very successful. However, when they released Hotline Miami, it was a huge success, and it rockets their careers to new heights which they weren't anticipating. The Sun and his levels are a reflection of this, being thrown into a storm of highly intense and wild missions, putting us on the trajectory of success. Other characters within Hotline Miami 2 serve as means to further themes and ideas. The henchmen gave a face to the countless people slaughtered by Jackie in the original Hotline Miami. Many parties seek fame and glory and wanted the spotlight shined on him instead of Jackie. Beard is just a normal guy who has left the war to live a simple life, but nothing in the world of Hotline Miami has a happy ending, as we evidently witness. Then finally, Richter is the individual who does what he has to do in order to secure a better life for him and his mother. And from the very start, we learn the fate of all these characters when Richard visits Martin and tells him that this story is going to have a twist that no one will like. Ovendale did a phenomenal video on Hotline Miami 2, breaking down and sharing his own interpretation on the characters, which I highly recommend you check out. Hotline Miami 2 succeeds in showcasing the participation and escalation of violence and its gruesome results. This is just my interpretation of Hotline Miami 2, and there are countless other people who have their own thoughts and ideas on what the story or characters are supposed to tell or represent, and that is the beautiful part of Hotline Miami 2. It's a game I could only appreciate for what it was on a second playthrough, and if you're like me and you didn't enjoy it for the first time, I highly recommend you give it another shot after watching this video. For what seems like an easily digestible, ultraviolet top-down shooter, offers something so much more than what the player was intending to originally experience. The story is told in an extremely messy fashion, but it's on purpose, so it keeps the player guessing on what will happen next, rather than serving it up on a silver platter. It's a franchise that most gamers need to experience for what it is and sets out to achieve. Hotline Miami 2 is truly a fantastic game for its extremely exciting and enjoyable repetitive gameplay loop, super electrifying soundtrack, and great story which is told through the various characters. I'd really like for people to share their own interpretation of Hotline Miami 2 in the comment section down below. I'd really like to hear your thoughts. So that is it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, please leave a like. Also, if you do enjoy content like this, be sure to hit that subscribe button and click on the bell icon to turn on notifications so you don't miss my next upload. With that being said, I want to give a special shout out to my YouTube members and Patreon supporters: Cyberboy, Camino VT, Salvi, George Kent, Luke AV, BPG, Veggie Hotdog, Whaley, Swift, Stam Shaw, Storm Mage, Sue Halep, Cheesy Chicken Gran, Rachel Vincent, Joshua Wright, Toxic Gamer 23, Forest Till I Die, Slack K Gaming, and Cat Smith. So that's it for this video. Hope you guys enjoyed it, and thanks for watching.